Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show, Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. I think it was Michael Kinsley who named that the most boring headline ever, and it's become kind of a meme. But there seems to be a revolt against the lockdown mentality amongst a good part of Canadian physicians. And perhaps coincidentally, the sainted Dr. Theresa Tam, the queen of the lockdown, announced an hour ago, in the spirit of following good public health advice, I will be taking some time off to recharge. During this time, Dr. Howard Njoo, Deputy Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, will deliver briefings and tweets via this account to keep Canadians informed. What do we know about this person? Perhaps he is a newcomer to our country, like Theresa Tam. But there was, I can't say that I'm surprised, but there was a major announcement made by a number of high-ranking physicians in Canada, and I didn't see any treatment of it. I didn't see it on National News Watch. I didn't see it on CBC. Perhaps I missed it. But Alex Berenson tweets, "Oh, Canada, Canadian physicians, including Canada's first chief public health officer, have just called for ending lockdowns permanently, even if outbreaks continue. Quote, adults need to go to work. Family and friends need to meet, unquote. Read the letter yourself at balancedresponse.ca. Ann Coulter gets to the heart of this when she responded to Berenson, Canada doesn't need to defeat Trump. So let's take a look at this. You can find it, or the introduction to it, at balancedresponse.ca. And it says on their homepage, COVID-19 is a serious threat to the health and well-being of Canadians. The measures that have been taken to control the spread of disease also represent a serious threat. Both the disease and the control measures have had serious consequences for population health and equity. We believe that a balanced response is required as we continue to deal with COVID-19. Our goal is to create a dialogue regarding the need for balance between the consequences of COVID-19 and the consequences of the control measures as key decisions are made." You may have noticed that in the United States as well as Canada, the consequences of the control measures are never mentioned. They're never mentioned by the politicians, well, except for Donald Trump, certainly not Andrew Cuomo or Gavin Newsom, and they're certainly not mentioned by the health dictators who have ushered in the sanitary dictatorship. But of course, every action typically has costs and benefits. So this letter, the open letter, is addressed, dated 3 days ago, to the Prime Minister and to the premiers and leaders of the territories. And it begins, the undersigned represent current and past leaders in public health, healthcare systems, and academia. We are writing to you with our thoughts regarding a balanced approach to dealing with COVID-19. We strongly believe that population health and equity are important considerations that must be applied to future decisions regarding pandemic management. The current approach to dealing with COVID-19 carries significant risks to overall population health and threatens to increase inequities across the country. Aiming to prevent or contain every single case of COVID-19 is simply no longer sustainable at this stage in the pandemic. We need to accept that COVID-19 will be with us for some time and to find ways to deal with it. The current and proposed measures for reopening will continue to disproportionately impact lower income groups, wait for it, Black and other racialized groups, recent immigrants to Canada, Indigenous people, and other populations. And it risks significantly harming our children, particularly the very young, by affecting their development with lifelong consequences in terms of education, skills development, income, and overall health. Canada must work to minimize the impact of COVID-19 by using measures that are practical, effective, and compatible with our values and sense of social justice. We need to focus on preventing deaths and serious illness by protecting the vulnerable while enabling society to function and thrive. Elimination of COVID-19 is not a practical objective for Canada until we have a vaccine. While there is hope for a vaccine to be developed soon, we must be realistic about the time it will actually take to develop and evaluate it and then deliver an immunization campaign covering the entire population. We cannot sustain universal control measures indefinitely. We need to accept that there will be cases and outbreaks of COVID-19. We need localized control measures that are risk-based. We should consistently reassess quarantine and isolation periods, recommendations for physical distancing, and non-medical masks, and travel restrictions based on current best evidence and levels of risk. At the same time, we must improve infection prevention and control in long-term care and congregate living settings. We should provide support for people living in the community who need to or choose to isolate when the disease is active, as well as those who have been adversely affected by COVID-19 or the consequences of the public health measures. Canadians have developed a fear of COVID-19. Going forward, they have to be supported in understanding their true level of risk and learning how to deal with this disease while getting on with their lives, back to work, back to school, and back to healthy lives and vibrant, active communities across this country. We acknowledge the heroic work that has been done in recent months by many across all levels of government and the public and private sector, and the sacrifices that Canadians have made to get to this stage. As we look forward, Canada must balance its response to COVID-19. And this is signed by Robert Bell, former Deputy Minister of Health, Ontario, former President and CEO of the University Health Network of Toronto. David Butler-Jones, Canada's first public health officer and former Deputy Minister for the Public Health Agency. Jean Clinton, Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University. Tom Clausen, former President, CEO, University Health Network, Toronto, and also of the Capital Health Region of British Columbia. Janet Davidson, former Deputy Health Minister, Alberta Health, former CEO, Trillium Health Centre, and many other worthies. There's about 15 to 20 different people who have signed this. And let's see. From the actual statement, it says, in overall population health terms, COVID-19's direct impact on premature mortality is small. While those under the age of 60 account for 65% of cases, they represent just 3% of deaths. With ready access to health services, severe outcomes can be averted in those who do not have pre-existing risk factors. In March 2020, unprecedented public health measures were implemented in Canada in response to the rapid rate of growth of cases and the potential threat to the health system. Because of the potential for exponential growth in cases and the situation in other parts of the world, our governments took these actions that applied to the entire population in order to protect our healthcare system. These interventions were meant to buy the time necessary to develop a longer-term response. They should not be used as a means of eradicating the disease. While some countries have been successful in suppressing the disease, most continue to see sporadic cases and outbreaks. Only a few countries, primarily island nations, appear to have eliminated the disease, but it is uncertain how long those countries can completely isolate themselves from the rest of the world. And I'll just break in here to say that, oh yes, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has been hailed to the skies for her sterling and feminist work in beating COVID. None of these people seem to mention that New Zealand are two rather small islands in the middle of nowhere. But also Newfoundland, which I believe has had, 0 or 1 death from COVID-19, is a rather larger island, which is not quite, but almost in the middle of the North Atlantic. And in my own island, Vancouver Island, there have been something like 130 cases, and I believe 3 deaths, and we have a population of almost 800,000 people. So natural isolation obviously counts for a lot. The public health measures did protect our healthcare system to the point that Canada had excess capacity. Our leaders and public health authorities had to use strong language to support universal acceptance of these measures. As a result, many Canadians have become fearful of COVID-19 and are worried about the impact of working, seeking routine and preventative medical care, participating in religious and cultural events, interacting with their family and friends, using public transportation, shopping, and other normal activities. Well, you see that the worthies who signed this letter, they are quite keen not to criticize the initial hysterical reaction from the Canadian authorities, which is probably wise of them. But the point that they are making essentially is that the pandemic is over in Canada, and there is no need for any of these panic-stricken measures, particularly the ones that have come just this month, such as Ottawa and Toronto deciding on mandatory masks. Let's see, the societal costs of maintaining these public health measures, even with some gradual relaxation, are too high. Canadians are missing scheduled medical appointments and surgeries, which will lead to increased deaths. There are significant challenges for our young with impact on early childhood development, one of the strongest predictors of lifelong health and social outcomes. Education is compromised. There are increases in domestic violence, alcohol and drug intake, and food insecurity. The economic consequences are huge. This leads to increased unemployment, which is related to increased deaths, and the toll on mental health is just beginning to be felt. Personal concerns about the disease, cases and deaths in friends and family, loneliness and isolation, worries about jobs and finances, parents having to juggle childcare and general insecurity are leading to increased levels of anxiety, depression, and strength. You see, what these physicians and others, medical professionals, are doing here is taking a holistic view of the effects of COVID-19. Now, holistic has been a very popular word for decades now, but you will note that the people who made the decisions, and the decisions which are, well, still ongoing, they have not taken a holistic view. Again, as far as I can see, the only national politician who did, well, in the West anyway, is Donald Trump, and he was mocked for this. But bravo to these doctors, and shame on the Canadian media for giving this big story as little attention as possible. I see that there is still a spirit of freedom that exists in Canada. This is from CTV News. Protesters ride at TTC, that's the Toronto subway, without masks to call for an end to mandatory face coverings in Toronto. Let's see. Oh, yes. Evidence shows that wearing a mask indoors can help reduce the spread of COVID-19. It's a simple, affordable, and reasonable action for each of us to take to save lives, Toronto Board of Health Chair Joe Cressy said Tuesday. I will continue to point out that there is no consensus on the claim made by Joe Cressy. About 40 activists boarded a TTC subway car at Dundas Station without masks on, saying cities should not be making their use mandatory. You have a choice. This is about freedom of choice. Chris Sky told CP24, when the government mandates something, it is never in your best interest. And I see that a lot of the protesters are wearing T-shirts that say hugs, not masks. Toronto Mayor John Tory said Tuesday that the protest was understandable but not concerning due to its size. It is 40 people, and 40 people out of 3 million isn't a very big number. That's kind of curious. You know, when the protests are small, the establishment always speaks to the numbers. When the protests are large, well, they speak to the justice of the issue. About 500,000, 500,000 to 600,000 people converged on London to oppose Britain's involvement in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the attitude of the government was, what are you going to do about it? Huh? A similar number converged on London to protest the banning of blood sports, and again, the reaction of the Blair government was, what are you going to do about it? In other words, your protest is irrelevant unless you were protesting for things we have already decided that we are going to do. Let's talk about the economic consequences of Canada's hysterical reaction to COVID-19. There was a budget snapshot released in Canada yesterday by Finance Minister Bill Morneau. And let's see, this is John Iveson of the National Post, describes it as a self-congratulatory effort that slapped his government on the back for its COVID-19 performance and offered no new details beyond an eye-popping deficit forecast of $343.2 billion, a full $87 billion higher than the best guess by the parliamentary budget officer. To Americans, $343.2 billion doesn't sound very much, but keep in mind that Canada has only 38 million people. Iveson continues, the likely cause of a deficit that has gone from mildly hallucinatory to mind-altering is the amount allocated to the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. The new update sets aside $82.3 billion for CEWS, even though the take-up so far has been disappointing. Private sector economists estimate Canada's GDP will decline 6.8% this year and bounce back with growth of 5.5% in 2021. I can't imagine where they came up with this 5.5% growth in 2021 figure. Because much of the Canadian manufacturing industry was at death's door. And the only reason that Canada has a manufacturing industry is that, our dollar is down to, 65 cents versus the American dollar, something like that. It has been heavily discounted on purpose for decades now, again, to support the manufacturing industries in Ontario and Quebec. The Department of Finance has a more gloomy view, suggesting it had modeled two scenarios. One envisages a resurgence of uncontrolled transmission later this year. Go second spike, resulting in an 11.2% decline in real GDP in 2020. The other sees a slower paced recovery than the private sector economists imagine, as households remain cautious and avoid public spaces, including restaurants and non-essential shopping. Well, that'll be great for business. Yes, in turn, businesses face low demand, operate under capacity, and fire workers. Under this scenario, GDP slips by 9.6% this year. Here's a big difference between Canada and the United States. Canada does not have a reserve currency. It does not have the petrodollar. Canada has no money machine that goes brrr. Canada has to borrow money, and its credit worthiness was just reduced. And of course, these credit ratings are ridiculously high for everyone. The companies get in trouble, serious trouble, if they tell the truth about economies. But we've been told by some pretty authoritative figures that nothing to worry about. $1 trillion in debt for Canada, nothing to worry about. Someone called Ryan Campbell, who is an economist with the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, writes on Canada National News Watch, which is it's the primary deep state organ of Canada. The fiscal response to the pandemic is massive, but we should remain calm. The federal debt burden is manageable, and we have more important things to worry about. Yeah, 1.2 trillion national debt. Expect pundits to repeat this figure over and over again to drum up fear. These numbers are big, but meaningless without context. First and foremost, we are dealing with a health crisis. Success means saving lives, preventing healthcare systems from being overwhelmed, and preventing the economic damage that would occur if the virus were to spread out of control. Cost is and should be secondary. No, you buffoon, deliberately smashing the economy leads to enormous economic damage, and we in Canada have just seen the beginning of it. Every action has a cost, but no, we're saving lives. And saving lives by how? By forcing infected people into nursing homes. He continues, the fiscal shock is serious but less threatening when put into historical perspective and scaled against the size of the Canadian economy. Canada's net debt may have crossed the $1 trillion mark, but apart from being a big round number, the threshold itself is not particularly frightening. In 2018 to 19, well before the crisis, Canada's debt was sitting at 30.9% of GDP. Yeah, they like to talk about percentage of GDP, not about the actual deficits or debt themselves. And there's a reason for this. And one of the reasons is that government inputs count for GDP. The government borrows money for programs, and this grows the economy, the way that the GDP is calculated. Oh, and here we get to a very popular whopper. The cumulative impact of the war effort in the 1940s resulted in debt levels as high as 130% of GDP. Yeah, that is a fatuous comparison, and I'll explain why. That in 1945, at the end of World War II, there was no welfare state to speak of in Canada. There weren't these vast armies of civil servants, both federal and provincial. In fact, non-military expenditures in Canada in 1945 were tiny. Secondly, the Canadian economy, even before it was deliberately smashed by the COVID-19 panic, was already reeling from the collapse of the oil and gas sector, which accounts for 18% of federal revenues and for a much, much higher percent of provincial revenues in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. We have this thing written into our Constitution called equalization, and it's the only thing keeping Quebec and the Atlantic provinces afloat. Essentially, the so-called have provinces are robbed to pay the so-called have-not provinces, and Quebec is a perennial have-not province, even though that its welfare system is far more generous than the rest of Canada's. They have $5 a day daycare there, paid for by the provincial government, but in effect paid for by the taxpayers of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. I follow the Canadian news fairly closely. I have seen no discussion at all of how the equalization system in Canada can possibly continue with the economies of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan smashed. And third, in this rubbish analysis, there's no attempt to explain how revenues will grow to meet even interest payments. What's going on in Canada now? I suppose it's best described as whistling past the graveyard. Let's see, Donald Trump tweeted today, for the 100th time, the reason we show so many cases compared to other countries that haven't done nearly as well as we have is that our testing is much bigger and better. We have tested 40 million people. If we did 20 million instead, cases would be half, etc., not reported. I responded, the deliberate misuse of the word cases by experts and the MSN incites panic. A person with no symptoms is not usually referred to as a case, and few of those under 50 infected with COVID-19 manifest anything other than minor symptoms or none. Let's talk about evil here, okay? Because if it bleeds, it leads. We all know this about the media. So the media has always been prone to sensationalize events. But now we're into the realm of pure evil here, where the mainstream media in the United States has decided to destroy the American economy in order to continue to foment panic in the hope of defeating Donald Trump in November. Anderson Cooper was talking on CNN about children returning to school, and apparently that's just not on. Wednesday on CNN, this is from Breitbart, anchor Anderson Cooper accused President Donald Trump of not caring about the health and safety of American children. He said, quote, "Today, the President of the United States did something rare. He expressed a notion we can all agree on, that kids belong in the classroom, but then made it quite clear beyond what it means to himself and his reelection, he doesn't actually care about those kids at all. He doesn't care about their health and safety, nor the health of their teachers and parents, and federal guidelines for keeping them safe." This is poisoning the well, pure and simple. He continued, "The president bragged today about getting the CDC to change their guidelines to weaken them, and lo and behold, the CDC, which used to be a world-respected organization, they're going to come up with new guidelines, less difficult ones. Just think about that. The CDC puts together guidelines based on science to protect kids and teachers staying 6 feet apart and masks and having airflow in rooms and washing hands. Because the president thinks it's too difficult, the CDC is going to weaken them. We don't want guidance to be too tough," the vice president said. "Let's just have guidance based on magical thinking or a pamphlet written by the advisors Diamond and Silk." The president threatened retribution for schools. I'm quoting a tweet: "In Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, schools are open with no problem. Dems think it would be bad politically if they open schools before the November election, but important for the children and families, may cut off funding if not open." Yeah. The risk to children from COVID-19 is essentially zero. Essentially zero. Teachers have stopped teaching. They're still getting paid. And we hear more and more that they do not intend to go back to the classroom in August or September. It's just not safe. Oh, well, if they're worried about safety, perhaps they shouldn't drive their cars to school, because they could always get into an accident, even a fatal accident. There's no way to prevent that. If they don't work, they shouldn't get paid. Simple as that. There's plenty of people who would gladly take their jobs. One doesn't need a bachelor's degree in education to teach school, particularly the younger grades. But as I say, Anderson Cooper and CNN, they are enemies of the people. They are public menaces. And do we have another public menace here? Oh, yes. Dr. Anthony Fauci. He says it's a false narrative to take comfort in a lower rate of death. Well, only vampires don't take comfort in that. Get this guy off the stage now. The longer his advice is heeded, the more people will die needlessly. Yes, we find out that the IFR, the infection fatality rate of this, is much, 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 much lower than the models claimed. That's a good thing, right? No, it isn't, according to Anthony Fauci. It's a false narrative to take comfort in a low rate of death. There's so many other things that are very dangerous and bad about the virus. Don't get yourself into a false complacency. It's like he's cheering. He's cheering for the coronavirus. It's just astonishing that, we're not going back to normal, and we'll just keep this alive, or at least the panic associated with it, going for as long as we possibly can. I've got more to say on COVID-19 and particularly the panic and the future. But first of all, let's go to the chat. Chogankin 666 says, "I tripped on a BLM street painting and got blood on it. I was arrested for vandalism and hate." Yes, 2 people were arrested for vandalizing a Black Lives Matter painting slogan on the street. Oh, in West Vancouver, the police are looking for people to help with their inquiries because a skid mark was found on a rainbow crosswalk. That's right. Let's see, there's a rainbow crosswalk in downtown Victoria, right across from City Hall, where they fly the rainbow flag. There are 3 city councillors in my city, Victoria. Sorry, there are 9 city councillors in Victoria, and 3 of them are lesbians. That's a little more than diversity, right? Considering lesbians are about, I don't know, 1 in 67 people. Yeah, hang on. Let's see what else we got here. Justin Proto says, regarding yesterday's story of racism as a mental illness, what if all of our compatriots who have been thrust into the system via political arrests of late just plead insanity? What say you? Well, it's a lot more difficult in the United States to plead insanity than it once was. I don't know. It used to be, people have done this in the past. They have mocked various forms of mental illness in order to stay out of prison, which in the United States are horrendous places. But then they have found out that mental institutions in the United States are not exactly salubrious places. You know, I suppose you could, if you're a good enough actor, you could pretend to be catatonic, but that pretense, you know, not saying anything, showing no affect, you're liable to get whacked up with a whole bunch of drugs, and the lack of communication with others is likely to induce serious mental illness itself. Okay, Glib Medley says, past a white girl biking with a sign on her basket, Black Women Matter, with women spelt with a Y. Shouldn't it be spelt with an X? I thought that the X had replaced the Y. Jonathan Paul says, USSR had psycho prisons. They were worse than normal ones. Bulgarian horticulture specialist PhD says the ability for a Brazilifying post-American collection of goblinas to even implement these recommendations is eroding by the day. Well, I've commented on this in the past. What I see coming out of particularly California suggests to me that their ability to maintain modern civilization has become tenuous. Chogokin 666 says USSR and Cuba use claustrophobic detainment as torture, which is terrifying. Well, indeed it is. There's a long-running argument in the United States about whether solitary confinement should be considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Bill of Rights. Difficulty, of course, being that there are some prisoners who are so consistently violent and deadly that they're both, you know, to the guards and other prisoners, that there's really no other option. Mr. Chuck the Buck Norris says, is there an objective test for schizophrenia? No, of course there isn't. As Thomas Zass famously pointed out, the symptoms are the disease. Well, of course, you know, there's another problem there. As Adam Curtis pointed out in, I think it was the Century of the Self, that for the longest time, psychiatrists diagnosed people based on, you know, things that they said, as well as their actions, without taking into account whether there might be rational reasons for things that they say. You know, my daughter is trying to kill me. You know, my family is trying to, you know, they're all trying to drive me crazy. Maybe that's true, you know, maybe that's true. Okay. Russians think you're crazy if you go to a shrink telling dark secrets to strangers, says Glib Medley. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. A lot of truth in it. Yeah, especially since this fellow is being paid to listen to you. There's a great scene in that movie, Todd Solondz's Happiness, where the psychiatrist is listening to a patient speak, and he's sitting in his chair. The patient is on the couch, supine on the couch, and he's thinking about, oh yeah, what did my wife tell me to buy? What was it? What is it? 2 quarts of milk, what butter, bread? Did she say bread? I'm sure that goes along. That happens all the time. Jaco Rapila says, with social media, the Western world has gone beyond the shrink. Seeing these days, people tell their dark secrets to every stranger on the planet. Yeah, and that's dangerous because it means that these secrets become meaningless. Oh, this is terribly important to me. Oh, this is so, shameful. Is it really that shameful? It was really that shameful. Why are you telling everyone on earth? Why are you telling strangers? Why would you do that? And, oh, let me tell you about, my crippling condition or my crippling fears. You mean you suffer from the same thing that supposedly everyone else does now? As I say, it's become normative. And if it's normative, then, why would we care? Walrus Libertarian says, I went to a coffee shop at midnight and there was about 10 East Indian kids hanging out in the parking lot. Nice kids, but replacement is real. Oh, well, yeah, of course it is. I'll have more to say about that when I talk about Joe Biden. Oh, I see. Iraq is very hot, but it's a dry heat. 115 Fahrenheit. Yeah, 115 today in Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, that leads to people dying. Air-conditioned places. Tom Wolfe wrote about this in one of his books. People go to the casinos in Vegas, and American air conditioning is much stronger than Canadian air conditioning. American air conditioning hits you like a wall. It's quite a feeling, quite a sensation. So these oldsters, they spend hours in the air-conditioned comfort of the casinos, and they walk out onto the sidewalks, blammo. They just keel over and die. Jonathan Pohl says, everything was air-conditioned in Suleimani, so it felt a lot cooler than here. Well, I suspect that any kind of activity at all in places like that would be impossible without air conditioning. Indeed, before air conditioning, there was very little that came out of the south of the United States. And after air conditioning, there was a tremendous movement of people and business to the south. YT, do y'all think Anderson Cooper and Don Lemon? No, I'm not gonna get into that. But they're again, in terms of the employment of homosexuals, CNN seems to be going above and beyond the call of duty. What'd you say? Did KMG already talk about SCOTUS giving away East Oklahoma? No, I'm going to talk about that later. Beyond depressing, says Walrus Libertarian. Yeah, beyond depressing to crazy, actually. Jonathan Pohl says, yes, the SCOTUS has restored the last slave territory to exist in the U.S., the Indian Territory. Laramie Hirsch says, expect activist judges and feminist congresswomen to start giving away other chunks of the U.S. in the near future. Chad Chadson, our valiant moderator, says, I was in Redding, that's California, right? Last week, got up to 114. Okay, so there was a piece, an interesting piece by the Z-Man today called Strange Days, and that the world was going to end because of COVID-19. And there were all manners of ways in which the world was going to end. He comments, here we are 4 months on, and the world does not look like anyone imagined it when this all started. The promised bodies in the street never materialized. The virus has thus far been a severe flu season hyped up by mass media. The promised depression has not made an appearance. The streets are still mostly empty during the workday, and many businesses are still closed. He lives in Baltimore, the Z-Man does, for reasons that mystify me. Where I live, in Victoria, the streets are most certainly not empty during the work day. But those that are open have all sorts of restrictions, and they seem to have fewer customers. What we don't have is people out banging their pots and pans, demanding the government do something about the economy. A lifetime ago, a handful of white people showed up at state capitals demanding the end of the lockdowns, but that soon gave way to swarms of blacks and Antifa promising to burn the cities. Otherwise, the productive portion of society seems to have gone back to sleep. Those working from home, work from home, and those not working, stay home. The weekly jobless claims say that 30 million Americans are currently unemployed, but no one seems to notice or believe it. Of course, no one should believe the official statistics from the government and other sources. The only true thing about these numbers is that they are revised constantly. We do know that 30 million people are still collecting unemployment benefits at the moment. The virus and the economy are a good example of partisanship. The panic crowd, which overlaps considerably with the anti-Trump Hamilton listening set, was so sure the virus was a plague sent by the gods because of Trump, they are convinced the hospitals are overrun and people are dying in the streets. Finally, the skeptics of modern economics are so sure the system cannot lapse, they believe we are in a grinding depression that will explode into civil unrest at any moment. Let's see, putting that aside, what we are seeing in the economy runs counter to pretty much everything we've been told for generations. The government should not be able to manufacture trillions of dollars without causing hyperinflation. Well, it could still happen. And we have seen inflation. The official numbers are worthless. The official numbers are rigged in order to make it look like the GDP is actually growing, which it isn't. But he makes an interesting point here. 40 years ago, the left was endlessly going on about free speech and the dangers of corporate media. Today, it is the right that champions speech and opposes corporate media. He talks about the decline, the collapse in spending leading to a reduction in credit card debt, which is now the lowest it has been in over a decade and headed for unprecedented lows. The weirdness in the economy is just one item. No new movies or television have come out since the panic, and no one seems to care very much. Sports entertainment has been shuttered, and no one seems to care. All of the spring and summer youth sports have been canceled. This time of year, kids into baseball, lacrosse, soccer, and big-time football would normally be in summer leagues. Their parents would be toting them around the country. None of that is happening. You can probably spend the better part of a day listing the things that used to be a fixed part of daily life that are now gone. More important, they are gone and no one seems to notice or care. Talk to people with kids in the summer sports and they will tell you the kids have quickly adjusted. They are doing other things. Parents with small kids are quickly adjusting to life at home with the kids around all day. Kid sounds are the background music of Zoom sessions. The point of all this is that we are like people who have been dumped out of their canoe in the rapids, and we are now being swept downriver. All sorts of things are happening to us and around us, but we have no way of getting our bearings. The thought of getting back into the canoe has long passed. Now it is just a matter of surviving each minute until the river calms or we bash our head into a boulder. We have no perspective and no way to gain perspective until we reach flat water. That means we really have no idea where this will all end. Maybe that's why there is a strange calm over daily life. Maybe that's why people are instinctively paying down debt and hunkering down. It may not make total sense, but in uncertain times, simplifying the household finances became a point of stability. Again, it is hard to know as we are all just being swept along. Still, the one thing we can know is that we are being swept along by forces outside our control. There's a piece here on from the Off Guardian by J.B. Handley called Second Wave, Not Even Close. Why the pessimism? Come on, second wave. Come on, second spike. You can do it. Why did politicians ever lock down society in the first place? Can we all agree that the stated purpose was to flatten the curve? You remember that phrase? I guess the people who used to parrot it don't want to be reminded of it. So our hospital system could handle the inevitable COVID-19 patients who needed care. At that point, at least back in early March, people were behaving rationally. They accepted that you can't eradicate a virus, so let's postpone things enough to handle it. The fact is, we have done that, and so much more. The headlines are filled with dire warnings of a second wave, and trigger-happy governors are rolling back regulations to try to stem the tide of new cases. But is any of it actually true, and should we all be worried? No, it's not a second wave. The COVID-19 virus is on its final legs, and while I have filled this post with graphs to prove everything I just said, this is the only really graph that you need to see. It's the CDC's data over time of deaths from COVID-19 here in the US, and the trend line is unmistakable. And you see from February, March, end of March, it goes up like this, and then in mid-April, it goes down like this. Yeah. If virologists were driving policy about COVID-19 rather than public health officials, we'd all be Sweden right now. which means life would effectively be back to normal. The only thing our lockdowns have done at this point is prolong the agony a little bit and encourage governors to make up more useless rules. Well, yeah, useless. Not useless to them, because governors and premiers in Canada have discovered that, oh, yeah, there's supposed to be protections against government taking away our liberty. Just declare a health emergency and there's no more protections anymore. I'm just, COVID-19 is busted, but let's start making everyone wearing masks now. I'm expecting some trolling from these people. You know, the old joke about making everyone wear green on Thursday? Well, if they could conjure up some sort of health benefit out of that, maybe they'll, force us all to wear green on Thursday. Let's see. Alex Berenson. He's still fighting the good fight, and he's still speaking out for free speech because he is, of course, one of the people that there has been a cancel attempt. 86,000 students in Nashville, he tweets, a poor urban school district will be denied even the chance at in-person school in August, online only. That'll be tough for the 31% of students who don't have a computer at home. Yeah, I guess it will be tough. And I suppose there will be demands for all of these children to be issued laptops. This experiment has been tried before, and it hasn't worked out. That a great many of the kids, the first thing that they try to figure out or get someone to help them with is to receive porn on their laptops. These laptops are frequently broken accidentally or deliberately. They are frequently sold for money. Oh, yeah. Okay, so COVID-19 is busted, at least in Canada and North America, and pretty much everywhere. But there's a bubonic plague outbreak in China. Bubonic plague. That's a really serious infectious disease. This is from Breitbart. Simon Kent writes, an outbreak of the deadly and highly transmissible bubonic plague in China is being well managed by Beijing and is really no cause for alarm, the World Health Organization said Tuesday. What highly transmissible disease did the WHO say the same thing about in January? Oh my God, it was COVID-19, the coronavirus. Yeah, but of course the WHO, which told us that masks, you don't need to wear masks. Don't worry about it. They're universally respected. They would never, make up things or suppress information for political reasons. That is absolutely outrageous. Joe Biden. He's got to pose, he says. This is what he said in one of his latest blundering talks. That's from the Washington Times. Presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joseph R. Biden. This is this irritating New York Times style that we're going to give his full legal name. Actually, his full name, legal name is Joseph Robinette Biden. But no one ever calls him anything other than Joe Biden. But in any event, on Wednesday, he formally embraced citizenship rights for 11 million illegal immigrants and a full erasure of President Trump's Get Tough border policies as part of the party's new Unity platform. The former vice president would expand sanctuary locations, limit ICE's ability to deport criminals in local jails, and reverse deportations for some military veterans already ousted because of criminal records. The Unity platform, developed by backers of Biden and one-time chief rival Senator Bernie Sanders, would wipe clean every major immigration policy of the last 3.5 years, replacing them with more legal immigration and eliminating the controls that have tamped down on illegal immigration. The platform calls for an immediate 100-day halt to all deportations and would unleash an army of overseers to police the way the Border Patrol and ICE's deportation officers enforce immigration policy. A special eye would be paid toward the racial underpinnings of Trump policy. The plan said systemic racism has infected our immigration system, including our policies at our borders and ports of entry, detention centers, and within immigration law enforcement agencies' policies and operations. So if it was a white people who were being prevented from coming into the United States, would that be systemic racism too? I suppose not. But since 11% of the world is white, and the United States is the #1 destination for the rest of the world, we know that hundreds of millions of people, or perhaps billions, would come to the United States in a shot. And of course, these are overwhelmingly non-white. I guess immigration restriction itself is obviously systemic racism. The immigration proposal was one of 6 areas in the new Unity platform. The others are healthcare, education, the economy, criminal justice, and climate change. Okay, so here's the headline here. Joe Biden to working class blacks. No more jobs for you. They're all going to go to foreigners. I don't know that this would make much difference to black voters because they vote for the Democratic Party. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. It might make some difference to normies, particularly, nice white ladies. Because, black people should have an opportunity to have jobs in the United States, right? It is their country too. Breitbart Joel Pollack looked at this. He writes, here are 9 of the most radical proposals in the Unity document. Hang on just one second. Paris Climate Agreement on day 1. Shift the entire fleet of 500,000 school buses to American-made zero-emission alternatives in 5 years. Pollack comments, this is among the more wild-eyed proposals in the platform's climate change section. It is not clear who will produce these buses, presumably to run on battery power, or what is to be done with 500,000 currently functional buses that run on ordinary fuel, and how local school districts are meant to afford the cost. End cash bail. The platform calls for eliminating cash bail across the country, a radical experiment in criminal justice reform that has only just begun in California and New York, with results that are deeply concerning. Deeply concerning is like, it's journalism speak for batshit crazy. The idea is to reduce inequities, but in practice, the end of cash bail means releasing violent criminals to commit more crimes. Stop the practice of arresting children for behavior that ought to be handled in the principal's office. This is somehow a federal responsibility. Ending cash bail. This is a federal responsibility. School buses, that's a federal responsibility. Yeah. It must be somewhere in the Constitution. Perhaps it's in the Commerce Clause, or the 14th Amendment. They'll find a way. The Democrats want to stop what they call the school-to-prison pipeline, arguing students of color suffer disproportionate suspensions and arrests, which would mean that liberal teachers are racists. But as Andrew Pollack points out, failing to arrest violent children could allow them to buy guns as adults, which is how the Parkland, Florida shooting happened. Well, another reason why the Parkland, Florida shooting happened is the great many people told the authorities about this kid and that he was, as they say, a ticking time bomb, and they just ignored the warnings. We will repeal so-called right-to-work laws. It is not clear how Democrats will actually do this, since these laws are made at the state level. Well, what I was just saying about the Constitution there. Democrats will recognize unions with majority sign-up via so-called card check processes. The card check violates the right to a secret ballot and allows organizers to intimidate workers into voting to certify unions. Oppose private school vouchers. Yeah, the next step would be to ban homeschooling, of course. Provide a public option toward universal health care. This idea was so radical 10 years ago that Democrats left it out of Obamacare. But it's the beginning of Medicare for all, which Sanders wants to impose on everyone, and Biden wants to offer as a choice for now. There is no thought of achieving universal health care outside government, building on the recent reforms under the Trump administration, such as telemedicine, end the border wall, and provide a roadmap to citizenship for the millions of undocumented workers. Well, we talked about that previously. Biden immigration plan would eviscerate Trump policies. Yeah, I suppose this is being sold, has been sold to them on the basis that Trump's immigration policies are wildly unpopular. I see no reason to suspect that that is in fact the case. But the money men are saying, don't worry about it. Joe isn't going to do these things, because presumably the money men will tell him that he can't. Much like Alan Greenspan famously told Bill Clinton, just forget about these things that you want to do. I'm in charge here. This is from CNBC. Financial advisory firm Signum Global Advisors told clients on Thursday that they aren't convinced Joe Biden is going to be as progressive as some may hope if he beats Donald Trump in November. The firm told their corporate clients in a note that they believe the policy recommendations put together by task forces filled with allies of Biden's and the more progressive Sanders shows that the presumptive Democratic nominee doesn't plan to side too often with those on the left side of the political spectrum if he becomes president. Quote, the report is very aspirational. It pays lip service to some of the party's more progressive ideas, though has few specifics about how ideas will be achieved. Yeah, one wonders when this note was written, before or after actual specific proposals were released by the Biden campaign. Signum has previously told clients that they expect Biden to defeat Trump and for Democrats to flip the Senate. Well, I don't know. I mean, is it likely that they would say, oh my God, the world is coming to an end, sell, sell, sell? There is a clip here, which is real, of Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who is her voice and her gesticulations with her head. And she's wearing a party pink jacket. I don't know whether she has matching skirt or pants. She's very sort of girlish, coquettish affect to her. And she was asked about mobs tearing down statues, and this is verbatim how she replied, people will do what they do. Not my problem. I don't care. I don't have any sworn responsibility to uphold the law or anything like that. Just as far as the Democrats are concerned, Antifa is A-OK. This is from Fox News. A new report from a conservative group on the potential problems with large-scale mail-in voting argues that a recent push from states to send ballots to all registered voters for November's election would not only expose them to possible fraud, but could likely result in a significant waste of taxpayers' dollars. The report by the Honest Elections Project cites problems that have already arisen in a number of states, showing that including inactive voters, including those who have changed addresses or died, would result in money being spent on ballots that would never reach their intended recipients. At the very least, mailing ballots to every registration on file, knowing that a significant number of registrations are erroneous or outdated, is a significant waste of scarce resources, the report says, noting that a recent estimate from Clark County, Nevada, predicted it would cost at least $323,000 to mail ballots to inactive registrants. Yes, but what is the cost? How can one put a cost on replacing Donald Trump through fixing the election? You know, it occurs now, I'll read a little bit more here. When ballots were sent to inactive voters in Nevada's May primary, ballots were found piled up in post office trays outside apartment complexes and on community bulletin boards in and around Las Vegas. All the better for them to be harvested. One report said ballots were even found in a trash can. Look, if the authorities are going to send ballots to everyone who's registered, Well, what if these people go to the ballot box to vote? How can it be determined? How can they stop people from voting twice? Are they going to have a really, really, really long list? Are they going to have, I'm sure the computer system will take care of it, just like, that wonderful computer system at the Iowa caucuses that the Democrats won. Who won the Iowa caucus? I guess we'll never know. It will just remain a mystery. The good news is that it really slowed down Bernie Sanders' momentum. And this Pete Buttigieg guy, he's really going places. No, he's not, but he served his part, and I'm sure he'll be well rewarded. Oh, what happens when you import a large number of people to your country who come from countries whose cultures are vastly different from your own, whose cultures, say, have no historical attachment to, say, liberty or even to the rule of law? Well, America is beginning to find out. The Joshua Kaplan writes, Representative Rashida Tlaib on Wednesday seemingly endorsed fellow squad member Ilhan Omar's radical call for dismantling the whole system of oppression in the United States. My sister Ilhan said it best. Well, I knew that Ilhan Omar's, family and marital situation was weird, but I had no idea that Rashida Tlaib was in fact related to her. During a Tuesday press conference addressing systemic racism, Omar called for dismantling economic and political institutions beyond just law enforcement. The mortality rate for Black Minnesotans to COVID is twice as high as it is with other races. And for me, this is very personal because I lost my own father to the coronavirus, Omar said. Is this a new claim, by the way, from her? Look, the mortality rate for Black Minnesotans to COVID is twice as high as it is with other races for two reasons. One, they're juicing the stats. That someone is found positive for COVID, but they have a stroke or a heart attack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or they, die from complications from diabetes. And this follows to number two, that the so-called comorbidities, particularly obesity, clinical obesity, is off the charts amongst Black people. But let's not talk about that, because I guess it's kind of embarrassing. And besides, everyone knows that anyone can be healthy at any size, right? Congratulations to Joy Reid, or Joy Ann Reid. She seems to alternate between the two names, who now has the nightly anchor slot at MSNBC, replacing a white blonde man, Chris Matthews, who was forced to resign in March after a series of on-air gaffes and accusations of sexist behavior in the workplace. Reid's promotion is a significant programming move by Cesar Conde, the new chairman of NBC's new networks. Black women, including Gayle King of CBS and Robin Roberts of ABC. Oh, jeez. Again, how many lesbians do we need on television? Holding leading roles in morning and daytime television. Of course, we know that Joy Reid is not keen on the gays. Not keen on the gays. A decade ago, she wrote all these blog pieces making fun of Charlie Crist of Florida, claiming that he was homosexual. And then later, she said that most straight people cringe at the sight of two men kissing. A lot of heterosexuals, especially men, find the idea of homosexual sex to be, gross. Well, where's the lie? I'm reading from DNYUZ, that mysterious website. She initially claimed those posts had been fabricated and inserted into the archives of her blog by hackers intending to defame her. She even hired a cybersecurity expert. Later, she acknowledged that there was little evidence that the post had been faked. So if we eliminate the hacking, what does that leave us with? Well, I genuinely do not believe I wrote those hateful things because they are completely alien to me. She told viewers in April 2018 in a lengthy apology, saying she had grown up in a household like many in America, had conservative values on alphabet people issues. So what, she has some sort of psychotic break back then, or more likely she simply tried to lie her way out of it. Also famously or infamously, this woman confused Slovenia and Slovakia, and that's the kind of person you want as a news anchor. So, deeply ignorant woman, a long history of what are now called homophobic comments, which she lied about. Made a very serious accusation about hacking, and so, but she gets a plum job at MSNBC. I wonder why. Could it be affirmative action? Keep this area upscale, warns letter to interracial Wake Forest family. Residents of Wake Forest neighborhood expressed outrage Monday after learning that a family received an unsigned letter last week warning them against posting any Black Lives Matter signs in the yard. Please remember that the rest of us live in an upscale neighborhood and have spent the extra money to stay out of mixed neighborhoods and or the ghetto. No one wants trouble or any circumstance arising which could turn our neighborhood into a semi-ghetto. This letter is obviously fake and was obviously written by a Black person or Black persons, because upscale neighborhood, spent the money to stay out of mixed neighborhoods and or the ghetto. That is not the way that white people talk. But of course, yes, outrage. Something's got to change. We are all God's children. What happened to love thy neighbor, treat each other with respect and kindness? Those things don't matter to Black Lives Matter. The only thing that matters is Black Lives Matter. Mariana Morin said the letter is a reminder that racism is everywhere. It's not just in the city. It's not just in the streets. It's in this neighborhood, she said. Yes, and as Dr. Heinz Kiosk said, we are all guilty, except for Black people. They're never guilty of anything. Except, for caring too damn much. For just having too much righteous rage and heartache. And can anyone really condemn them for that? No, I don't think so. No good person, anyway. Oregon politician admits writing racist letter telling himself he's not welcome here. This is from Newsweek. Jonathan Lopez, a candidate for Oregon's Umatilla County Commissioner, said he had received the letter via his mailbox June 23rd. In a letter posted to his Facebook account, the typed letter addressed to Mr. Lopez has parts blurred out and appears to contain racial slurs. You are not welcome here. Will never be anything in this community or state. Umatilla County kills redacted like you and are dumped in the fields and river. That's why our crops are the best. That's exactly the sort of thing that a white person would write. Along with the letter, Lopez stated on Facebook that he had no resentment for whomever wrote this and that he was heartbroken for the lack of knowledge, education, and respect missing. Yes. He confessed, according to the police chief in Herbeston, he confessed that he wrote the letter. Yeah, big surprise there. Big surprise there. He's could be facing a Class A misdemeanor, initiating a false report. And let's see. The letter was written by me. It came from a dark, low place, Lopez said. It should never have been written. Lopez admitted that he was not suited or fit to be in public office or leadership, saying he'd been dealing with many emotions, feelings, and thoughts for several months. He'd never meant to mislead the public, and it was a big misunderstanding. Okay. All right. The letter incident is not the first time Lopez has encountered law enforcement officials, Edmiston told Newsweek. Let's see. He had applied 4 times to volunteer with the city or its fire district. They had to run a background check. He was arrested in 2013 in Virginia concerning some very serious person-to-person crimes involving a weapon. And he'd also been arrested in 2018 for impersonating a police officer. Yeah, there was something about this Joy Reid story which I neglected to say, which is really the heart of the matter. She said, "I am a black mom, a black woman, a black daughter. I'm also a journalist who can conceptualize that pain." Okay, black mom, black woman, black daughter equals pain. Okay. I'm also a journalist who conceptualizes that pain from a unique point of view, from the Joy-Ann Reid point of view. Every day I'm in this job, I'm very conscious of that responsibility to make that collective voice heard. It's unique to do that as a black woman. No, it isn't unique, actually, but I'm glad she feels so self-important. You may have heard that Will Smith, the actor, former superstar, he's not a superstar anymore, is he? His movies haven't been doing very well for the last decade, except for that cartoon movie. Or was it live action, the Aladdin movie? There's long been rumors about, him and his wife, Jada Pinkett Smith, being Scientologists, and also both of them actually being homosexual. But there was a claim made by some man that he had a long affair with Jada Pinkett Smith, and that Will Smith had agreed to this because it was an open marriage. That's another long-standing rumor, that they have an open marriage. So, I don't know, this wasn't looking very good for Will Smith. So what do? Talk about the N-word. Will Smith says he's been called the N-word by police on more than 10 occasions. And he actually used that word, and he didn't drop the R. And that's not allowed, is it? But we all grieve for Will Smith in his hour of need. Attorney General William Barr has announced the launch of Operation Legend, a sustained, systematic, and coordinated law enforcement initiative across all federal law enforcement agencies, working in conjunction with state and local law officials to fight the sudden surge of violent crime beginning in Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas City has already reached 100 homicides this year, a 40% increase from last year. Operation Legend is named after 4-year-old Legend Taliaferro, who was shot and killed while he slept early in the morning of June 29th in Kansas City. Let's see. I believe there's a reference to Black Lives Matter here, but that's the point of this press release, and I think that politically it's quite strong, because the violence, the black on black violence in the United States is horrifying to most people, and a call to do something about it. Let's see if I can just hang on a second here. Is that any better? I'm going to have to come up with a more permanent solution than just simply skulking away to the right side of the screen. But you'll have to bear with me until at least next week. Black Lives Matter. And if Black Lives Matter, let's try to do something to stop black people killing so many black people. Briefly, Peter Beinart has written, "I no longer believe in a Jewish state." And who's Peter Beinart when he's at home? Apparently, he's one of America's most senior intellectuals. A former editor of the New Republic. He's written for Time, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books. He's an associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He contributes to the Atlantic, National Journal, and CNN. And of course, he was a big-time cheerleader for the invasion of Iraq. He later admitted that this had been a mistake. But no, there should be one state, that Israel should no longer be a Jewish state. I just wonder about people like Beinart. What do they think is going to be the practical result of this? That the Arabs and the Jews are going to live together in peace? I mean, he really can't be that stupid, can he? Divided societies are most stable and peaceful when governments represent all of their people. That's the lesson of Northern Ireland. Oh, really? The lesson of Northern Ireland is that terrorism works, because the Tony Blair gave Ireland to the IRA with the Good Friday Agreement. I'm sure the Palestinians must be greatly heartened by Peter Beinart's piece in the New York Times. It's just, I don't know. It's difficult to account for stupidity as great as that. Oklahoma, from USA Today. The Supreme Court says Eastern Oklahoma remains Native American territory. A decision the state warned could create civil, criminal, and regulatory turmoil. Then why did you make it, SCOTUS? The 5-4 decision was written by Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch. Ooh, wasn't he this right-wing Trumpist monster? And joined by the court's 4 liberal justices. The justices considered the issue for the second time after failing to decide a different case last year when Gorsuch was recused and the court likely deadlocked. The case concerned an appeal from Jim C. McGirt, a Native American who claimed his state rape conviction from 1997 should be overturned because Oklahoma lacked jurisdiction. Congress, his lawyer Ian Gershengorn said, never properly terminated the reservation. During oral arguments in May, the justices reached back to 1907 to determine whether Congress, using imprecise language, failed to disestablish the 1866 boundaries of the reservation. If so, virtually half of Oklahoma, home to 1.8 million residents, and including Tulsa, would remain subject to federal criminal laws. We do not pretend to foretell the future, and we proceed well aware of the potential for cost and conflict around jurisdictional boundaries, especially ones that have gone unappreciated for so long, Gorsuch wrote. But it is unclear why pessimism should rule the day. With the passage of time, Oklahoma and its tribes have proven they can work successfully together as partners. Yes, opening bid, tribes to the state of Oklahoma. You want the half of your state back? We want $100 trillion. Okay? What's your counter offer? Because, you don't have jurisdiction in half your state anymore. It's going to be kind of difficult to run it, isn't it? The federal government promised the Muskogee Creek Nation a reservation in perpetuity, Gorsuch wrote, adding that while Congress had diminished the sanctuary over time, lawmakers had never withdrawn the promised reservation. As a result, many of the arguments before us today follow a sadly familiar pattern. Yes, promises were made, but the price of keeping them has become so great that by now we should just cast a blind eye. We reject that thinking. Oh, okay. The state solicitor general, Mithun Masangani, had warned in May that a ruling for Native Americans could require the release of over more than 1,700 inmates. That didn't sit well with several justices who feared a chaotic overhaul of long-decided criminal cases. What makes the case hard is that there have been hundreds of prosecutions, some very heinous offenses of the state law. On your view, they would all become undone, Ruth Bader Ginsburg told Gershengorn. Won't residents be surprised to learn that they are living on a reservation and that they are now subject to laws imposed by a body that is not accountable to them in any way? Look, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that there is a well-established legal principle called estoppel. Now, estoppel, there's very many manifestations of this, but here are 2, as explained by Wikipedia. Estoppel by silence or acquiescence, estoppel that prevents a person from asserting something when he had the right and opportunity to do so earlier, and such silence put another person at a disadvantage. Estoppel after a litigant deliberately and avoidably delays an action so as to disadvantage an adversary. There was a court case in Canada a couple of decades ago where a man took a case to the Federal Court of Canada claiming that he owned Labrador. Labrador is a large chunk of land which is just east of Quebec, and it is now part of the province of Newfoundland. And the federal court ruled that they weren't even bothered to look at the evidence. Now, he had a claim going back centuries, and supposedly his claim to Labrador, or his direct ancestors' claim to Labrador, perhaps it was legitimate, perhaps it wasn't, but the court invoked estoppel and said, after hundreds of years, we are not going to give you Labrador. Similarly, these cases where I know people in the United States, people in Canada have made cases, and some of them are very lengthy, stating that the federal income tax in both these countries is illegal. Even if it were illegal, the courts are not going to overturn them because what? Oh, the Canadian government is going to be refunding $150 trillion to Canadian taxpayers. No, that's never going to happen. What Neil Gorsuch and these other 5 justices have decided to do is they've decided to take a look at Canada, where in a recent Supreme Court verdict in my country, they decided to relitigate the Confederation of 1867 as it relates to an Indian tribe in British Columbia. That effectively, there is no certainty of title that exists in my country anymore, which is one of the reasons why economically it is doomed. Why would anyone invest in my country when any Indian band can claim, no, that is our land, or no, you can't do this in territory we claim, or even in close proximity to territory we claim because of the sacredness of the land, the great spirit, whatever. Oh, and we can adjudicate this and it'll take, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, and it will cost you, oh, I don't know, if you're a mining company, it might cost you a couple of $1 billion. Yeah, so invest in Canada. Apparently, this is the route that Neil Gorsuch wants the United States to go down. Am I seriously supposed to believe that more than a handful of these Indians in the state of Oklahoma thought that they were anything other than Americans? This is, well, I speak from Canadian experience, that if the United States Supreme Court has decided to go down the Canadian route, you are so screwed. This is just lead to absolute chaos. Of course, there's another possibility here, which is what Andrew Jackson famously said. Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Let's take a look at the chat before I go to Theater Thursday. Laramie Hurst says, responding to YT, I would want to see Central Park again, the Statue of Liberty with my family, the Empire State Building. It's a shame that WTC is gone. I never got a clear picture of the top of that one. Actually, some years ago, I went, down to the, what do they call it? That part of lower New York. Went to the WTC. It's a strange place to visit because the buildings are so huge and so ugly. And there were these vast plazas at the bottom, utterly deserted. Utterly deserted. It was like a neutron bomb had gone off. Jonathan Pohl makes a comment about pale-face law on the res. That's a serious problem. It's a serious problem in Canada, that Canadians have bought or entered into agreements, various legal agreements, including regarding, property and the like on Indian reservations, only to be told, sorry, you have no rights. You were very foolish to sign these agreements. And the fact that you lost a great deal of money, well, nothing we can do about it. Chogakin 666, you see what they did to Lincoln Center? They made it into a horrid postmodern glass box. Well, there is a rather handsome building for music called Carnegie Hall, built around 1900. And Isaac Stern, he led the campaign to refurbish it, and he wanted it to become, the home of the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera. But I guess if they'd moved those into Carnegie Hall, they would have had to admit that Lincoln Center was a tremendous mistake. And they are not going to do so. Astrology. The tribes have casinos in many places. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, gambling is associated with criminality up and down the line. I suppose it's, good on the one hand that the Indians are making money, but I wish it was a different way they were making it. All of the cultural attractions are closed shut. The theaters, the symphony, the ballet, New York City that we love is no more. Well, it would seem to me that if Mayor de Blasio and Governor Death have their way, they're gone forever. Once again, the Metropolitan and the New York Philharmonic are not going to be able to survive with 20% capacity. It's not possible. First Nations, this is a group. There's no such thing as First Nations. This is a political designation. They're called Indians, and they have Indian bands. Those are still the official terms, and if you talk to Indians in Canada, they call themselves Indians. But no, they were the First Nations. It's funny because a lot of these First Nations were on the move, constantly on the move. So I guess the nation is wherever they were, wherever these few thousands of people were at a time. Talking about moving to New York, Laramie Hurst is fascinated with the layers of history that are in the city, also the layers of wallpaper that are on every cheap apartment in New York City, the peeling wallpaper, which has been painted over again and again and again. I was shocked when I visited New York City. I stayed there for a month at how much it costs to live in a really rather dreadful apartment without air conditioning. And of course, it's a lot more than that now. Hopper says, I had an amplifier made out of Kevin's jacket material. No, wait a minute. I was reading about this amplifier company. Was it Orange? I think that the grill on it was similar to this. Maybe that's the one. Let's start a little early with Theater Thursday. And let me put that down there. Okay, the movie that we are discussing today is from 1979, and it is called All That Jazz. It is directed and co-written by Bob Fosse. It's co-written and produced by Robert Allen Arthur. And it stars Roy Scheider, Jessica Lange, Leland Palmer, and Anne Ryan King. The cinematography is by Giuseppe Rotuno, and it is edited, and he won an Academy Award for this, was by Alan Heim. And this movie won 4 Academy Awards. It was a moderate hit. It went considerably over budget and required 2 studios to finance it, but it managed to pay itself off. Of course, the choreography for All That Jazz is by Bob Fosse as well. And Fosse, I suppose, is probably best known even today for being a choreographer because his directing career was cut short when he died at the age of 60. Bob Fosse, one of the great Norwegian Americans, was born in 1927, and he started dancing professionally at the age of 13. He was what you might say ruthlessly ambitious. But I suppose he was never comfortable with his appearance. He was balding from an early age. He didn't like his hands. And so he decided that he and his dancers were going to wear hats. And he also decided that he and his dancers were going to wear gloves. Of course, a hat draws attention to the head, just as gloves draw attention to the hands. Michael Jackson's whole act, dance-wise, is pretty much ripped off from Bob Fosse's choreography. He started working nationally in the early 1950s, and he began doing choreography He moved into the theater. I believe he has won the record number of Tony Awards. And some of the hits that he was associated with were The Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, Sweet Charity, and Pippin. And of course, Chicago, which is parodied in All That Jazz. Of course, All That Jazz is a thinly veiled autobiography of Bob Fosse. In that his wife in All That Jazz is clearly based on his real life, Gwen Verdon, who was the most acclaimed dancers of her time. And of course, his girlfriend is played by, well, guess what? His real girlfriend, Anne Ryan-King. Bob Fosse decided that he wanted to get into movies. And the first movie that he directed was Sweet Charity, which is a musical comedy, which stars, which is based on a Fellini film, Nights of Cabiria. And of course, All That Jazz is, I don't know, is it stolen from Fellini's 8½? The cinematographer is the same, certainly, but Sweet Charity stars Shirley MacLaine. And of course, Cabaret, which won all the Oscars or close to it in 1972, which stars Liza Minnelli, Michael York, and Joel Grey. The curious thing to me about this movie that you see all these people, oh, yeah, Weimar Germany is so gay friendly. Ooh, it was so, out there, outre, artistically, and the like. And, when all the incipient Nazis sing Tomorrow Belongs to Me, I just think, have you people got it yet? Do you think that Weimar Germany had a happy ending? In 1974, Bob Fosse directed a film called Lenny, which is about Lenny Bruce. And you see in All That Jazz how Bob Fosse's real life is woven into this again and again and again through so many different angles. The unity of this film is simply astonishing. Lenny Bruce, of course, he started out in strip clubs, and that's where Bob Fosse started dancing, in strip clubs to make money. And Lenny Bruce married a stripper, Honey Harlow, who was played by Valerie Perrine in the movie. And in All That Jazz, Bob Fosse's character, Joe Gideon, is doing two things. He is putting together a musical comedy, which he is writing the book for and is choreographing. And he is also editing this movie that he has directed, which is called The Stand-Up. And it's about Lenny Bruce, although he's not identified as such. And there's many in-jokes in All That Jazz, but one of them is that the character who plays Davis Newman, who is the stand-up of the title, is played by Cliff Gorman. And Cliff Gorman was the fellow who played Lenny Bruce on Broadway. And when the movie was made, the studio said, no, stage actor, no one's ever heard of him. We're gonna get Hoffman to do this role. Now, as an example of the unity in this film, we see the same scene shot in slightly different ways, punctuating this film, and it is Joe Gideon beginning his day. And how does he begin it? He begins it with Vivaldi playing on a cassette recorder, with Visine, Alka-Seltzer, and Dexedrine, which is a form of amphetamine. And then he has a shower. And he stares at the mirror. It's showtime, folks. And you see from the beginning that Joe Gideon has a very ambivalent attitude towards show business. Well, does he love show business? Does he hate show business? I mean, it's his business. Let's see. There's a character in the film who's played by Ben Vereen. He plays a triple threat named O'Connor Flood. Triple threat means actor, singer, dancer. Ben Vereen, a triple threat too. And Ben Vereen's character, O'Connor Flood, is based very clearly on Sammy Davis Jr. He even has a Star of David around his neck, despite the fact that he's a black man. And it is an absolutely savage parody of that kind of show business where he's introducing, we never get to see him introduced, but he's introducing Joe Gideon. And Joe Gideon is predicting his lines before they happen. A great entertainer, a great entertainer, a great humanitarian, a great humanitarian, and my dear friend of 25 years, and my dearest, dearest friend for 20 years. And he says to his girlfriend, oh boy, do I hate show business. And she says, Joe, you love show business. Oh, that's right. I love show business. I'll go either way. Yeah. So we learned from the very beginning that bad things are going to happen to Joe. That we see flashes, very quick flashes of a veiled woman. What becomes clear is the angel of death. And she is a very attractive angel of death. Indeed, she is played by Jessica Lange at her most radiant. And he's attracted to her just as he's attracted to death, because everything that he's doing in his life is drawing him toward death rather quickly, as it turns out. And she is attracted to him, I don't know, because of his seeming fearlessness, although he confesses right before the surgery, final surgery, that he is deeply afraid of dying. There's really no manifestation of religion in this movie at all, except for one rather amusing scene where he's down on his knees looking up towards God and says, don't you like musical comedy? As I say, the editing by Alan Hyme won an Academy Award. It's rather breathtaking. The movie begins after the morning routine with, I believe it's a 13-minute piece, which is an open rehearsal for Joe Gideon's new Broadway musical comedy, NYLA. And you see what seems to be a couple of hundred people attempting to be in the cast, and you see them slowly being winnowed out. And you see what the songwriter for the musical, and you see the various producers of the musical, and they're observing this. And you see his ex-wife, who's a dancer, based on Gwen Verdon, and his daughter in the audience, and they're commenting on this. And this way, we're cleverly introduced to a lot of exposition that does not need to be explained. And what we learn from this and other scenes that, dancing is a very strenuous occupation. It's very, very difficult. There was a ballet movie made with Shirley MacLaine. I forget the name. It was really tedious because it lets show you how hard these people work. Okay. How about showing us how hard these people work in the context of something bigger than that? That's one of the reasons why this movie is so successful, is because it really eschews process. That the movie is about art, and it's about the cost, the toil of art on a man's life. Not that Joe Gideon is convinced exactly that he's creating art. In one scene, he points to he talks about a rose, that God made a rose. I can't do something like that. And again, this mirrors Bob Fosse. But let's talk about the music in this film, and in terms of the unity of it. All right. On Broadway was a hit song twice, and it was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, along with Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. And if you look at those four names together, you have probably about 50 hits that everyone recognizes. And it's very unusual to come across a movie that has songs in it that speak so directly to the subject matter. So I'm going to read the lyrics to On Broadway. They say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. They say there's always magic in the air. But when you're walking down the street and you ain't had enough to eat, the glitter rubs right off and you're going nowhere. They say the girls are something else on Broadway, but looking at them just gives me the blues. Because how are you going to make some time when all you got is one thin dime, and one thin dime won't even shine your shoes on Broadway? Ha! They say I won't last too long on Broadway. I'll catch a Greyhound bus for home. They all say, but oh, they're all dead wrong. I know they are. Because I can play this here guitar, and I won't quit till I'm a star on Broadway. So you see this desperation to be successful, and I suppose the understanding that very few people who seek to be stars on Broadway become stars on Broadway. And we see this in the bravura opening sequence, set piece, where one of Joe Gideon's strengths is his honesty with the people that he works with. That he doesn't have some flunky dismiss the dancers who don't come up to it, and often it's pretty close cut. That he comes up to them, shakes their hand, and puts a hand on the shoulder and sympathizes with them, because he started as a dancer himself and he knows how difficult it is to make it. But of course, with success, success in show business comes with this fear of failure, and it's a very rich cast that we have, very rich indeed. But we see a John Lithgow playing Lucas Sargent, who is seen to be Joe Gideon's rival, whose last show was a flop, and everyone is very conscious of this. Not least Lucas Sargent himself. Just to interrupt mainly what I was saying about songwriting, about the songs. There are a lot of great turns in here by a lot of fine actors, many of whom were not known at the time. CCH Pounder, very early appearance as a Caribbean nurse, and a little bit of social commentary here. Apparently, if you're very sick, you don't want to be looked after by people who are foreigners to your country. The final song in All That Jazz is an Irving Berlin song called There's No Business Like Show Business, which is best known in its completely over-the-top version in the 1954 movie There's No Business Like Show Business, sung by Ethel Merman. And what do the lyrics of this song have to say? There's no business like show business, like no business I know. Everything about it is appealing, everything the traffic will allow. Nowhere could you get that happy feeling when you are stealing that extra bow. There's no people like show people. They smile when you are low. Even with a turkey that you know will fold, you may be stranded out in the cold. Still, you wouldn't change it for a sack of gold. Let's go on with the show. The butcher, the baker, the grocer, the clerk are secretly unhappy men, because the butcher, the baker, the grocer, the clerk get paid for what they do, but no applause. They gladly bid their dreary jobs goodbye for anything theatrical. And why? There's no business like show business, and I tell you it's so. Traveling through the country is so thrilling. standing out in front of opening nights, smiling as you watch the theater filling, and then there's your billing out there in lights. Now, many of the critics said that ending this film with there's no business like show business, it sort of capped what was criticized as a very sour movie. Well, it's supposed to be sour. And Joe Gideon is threatened with death throughout most of this movie. And we find out that apart from, I don't know, 3 women who love him, everyone else is wondering exactly how much he is worth. And in fact, it turns out he is worth far more dead than alive. More than $500,000 so, which would be worth, I don't know, $5, $6, $7 million today. And so are the producers rooting for Joe Gideon to die? Well, perhaps not. But if they really wanted him to stay alive to open the show, perhaps they should have taken, measures to prevent his carrying on in the hospital. That would have been the prudent thing to do. There's another song which is very important in this film, which appears about in the middle of the film. It's by Peter Allen. It's called "Everything Old Is New Again," and we see a dance number to this tune, a live version of it, which is presented by Joe Gideon's girlfriend, Kate Jagger, and his daughter. And I'll get around to that a little later. Here's the relevant lyric. Don't throw the past away. You might need it some rainy day. Dreams can come true again when everything old is new again. Yeah. This is the dilemma. I might fall in love with you again. Joe Gideon, has he ever been in love? Well, he confesses to the angel of death because he says it a lot, because it seems to have an effect. But Joe wrestles with the pain in this film that he has done bad things, terrible things in his life, and there's really nothing that he can do about that. As to whether he can change, he has come to the decision that he can't change. And in fact, he when he thinks he's going to die before his operation, he apologizes to the women for all of the things that he's done to them. And he says, well, if I survive, then I apologize in advance for all the bad things I'm going to do to you. Joe Gideon is a very sympathetic character, and one of the reasons is because of his honesty. Now, he's duplicitous with women, no question about it, but they know who he is. What you see is what you get. And I don't know, Katie Jagger, she's played by Anne Reinking. And well, let's look at her attributes, all right? She is beautiful, sexy, highly intelligent, highly talented, completely besotted with Joe, and utterly devoted to his career. And you think that's not enough woman for you, Joe? But it isn't. He has this kind of sickness that he needs the novelty. And you see that with his interaction with a inferior dancer, played of Victoria Porter, played by Deborah Geffner at the beginning of the movie, that he tends to regard women artistically. What can he learn from this relationship? What can this new experience bring to me and to my art, which is a disastrous, way to go about relationships. But of course, Deborah Geffner is Victoria Porter with this sort of half smile on her face, and that face and her body, well, a hard woman to resist, but you see that he is ruthlessly honest with her in terms of her career. She wants to be a movie star, and she asks him, this is just before they go to bed for the first time, do you think I could be a movie star? And he, well, it's crazy business. And, she puts him to the test, and he says no. And, she is rather brutalized by this. And then later, during rehearsal, he is yelling at her, calling her out. And apparently this is based on his treatment of an earlier girlfriend dancer in Pippin. But he tells her, look, I can't make you a great dancer. I can't even make you a good dancer, but I can make you better. And he does. And you see this confidence that, I'm tempted, I've made this joke before with regard to other movies that I've talked about, that apparently the way to be successful with women is to be a massive, massive bastard. But you see, Joe Gideon has two things going for him. He is a success. It's not just that, he's a success. He's very good at what he does. He has mastery of something. Also, he has this force of character. He's not begging for the affection of women. They are coming to him more than he is going to them. And I say this honesty, this rather brutal honesty, well, it has a very strong effect on women. The woman that the character of Victoria's named is based on is called Jennifer Narn Smith. She appears in All That Jazz. She is just a gorgeous, statuesque brunette, sort of, situation, blink and you'll miss her. But you see, what Bob Fosse has done is that he has brought so much of his own life into this film. And what that means is there are a great number of good-looking women in this film. I'd have to say it's right up, near the top in terms of the number of really good-looking women. Now, sincerity. Is Joe Gideon, is Bob Fosse sincere? Well, sort of and sort of not. Don't bullshit a bullshitter, he says. He is, he knows. He knows about his own insincerity, and that in a way makes him sincere. There's a lot of despite this being a rather harrowing film, if you don't want to see open heart surgery, actual open heart surgery in a film, I guess you don't want to see this. I mean, there's not much of it. But it seems that, Katie Jagger is thinking of leaving Joe for all the obvious reasons. She's at his apartment, and he says, Kate, I try to give you everything I can give. And she says, oh, you give all right, presents, clothes. I just wish you weren't so generous with your cock. And he pauses and says, that's good. I can use that. I mean, it's a very funny line. It's a very true line, But the point is he's thinking about life artistically. That he is so devoted, so enveloped in his art that he seems to have he lives in a half world between art and life. In the same way, in All That Jazz, he is living in a half world between life and death, which becomes very clear in the last act of the film, which is a fantasy based entirely on, his belief that he is going to die. But, how would this be staged? And of course, it would have to be staged in the Bob Fosse manner. Everyone knows about my feelings about Stanley Kubrick. There is a strong Stanley Kubrick connection in this film, which I will mention. That Joe Gideon says during the film, I wonder if Stanley Kubrick ever gets depressed. It is reported that when Kubrick saw the film, he said, "I think this is probably the best film that I have ever seen." And we know from the latest biography of Bob Fosse that that Fosse thought that Kubrick was the best. There's also another connection here. There is a kind of movie reviewing didn't used to be about handing out 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5, turkeys or globes or balloons or whatever. And then this started to change in the 1970s, and there's a parody of this where we have a televised, I won't say film critic, movie reviewer who speaks in a glib, superficial, insulting manner. And she's played by a woman called Chris Chase, who sometime before was known as Irene Kane, who was the female lead in Stanley Kubrick's first film, Killer's Kiss, his first feature. He made a feature before that, but disowned it. And Chris Chase later became she was on CNN and the CBS Morning News. She became a big-time television star. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about here? Oh, yes, real versus fake. There are a number of, I get the impression watching this that, Stanley Kubrick believed that you could make a successful movie by stringing together enough scenes that were, watertight compartments. And all that jazz is constructed in a similar way. There's really kind of an astonishing scene, and it's really heartrending. Keep in mind, I don't like dancing, where Katie and Joe Gideon's daughter, who is played by, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, it's a Hungarian name, Erzsébet Földi, and she's just an adorable child, and it must have been quite a challenge to find a girl as sweet and as good looking, but who could actually dance, and act. But of course, children can't act. That typically comes from the director. Anyway, there's a scene where the two of them are at Joe's rather fabulous pad, multi-level pad, and they do a little number for him, which is based on the Peter Allen song I mentioned earlier, "Everything Old is New Again." And they worked out this choreography, and you can just see the delight in his daughter's eyes. Everything about her is just so delighted to be able to show off her dancing skills for her father. And we see the sad look on Joe Gideon's face when he thinks that he's not worthy of this, or that he can never appreciate it, that he's ruined everything. It's a bittersweet film, but you contrast this later in the film with these spectacular production numbers, of Joe Gideon's death and how this would be regarded. And you see that his daughter is sort of glammed up in this monstrous fashion so that she barely looks human. She has a long cigarette holder and the like. So you see this contrast between real emotion and fake emotion. And similarly, you see with the Ben Vereen character, who is just absolutely excruciating. And then in one of the final scenes in the film, where Joe Gideon has escaped from his hospital room, and he's in the basement of the hospital, and he smacks his head, and he's trailing blood, and there's water on the floor. And he runs into this old black man. He's a porter, I guess. He doesn't have a name. I'll just call him Old Black Joe. And so, the old black man doesn't know who Joe Gideon is. Meanwhile, the hospital is, in a panic because they've seemingly lost him. And so, he bums a cigarette off him. And later, he says, "Do you mind if I have another cigarette?" And, the old black man doesn't mind. And it turns out this old black man knows a bunch of old songs, and he loves singing them. in a non-show busy kind of way. And there is Joe Gideon and Old Black Joe, and they're singing "Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag." And you've never seen Joe Gideon as happy as this, because he's just retreated. He's retreated from the world of artifice into something that's real, into real human enjoyment. But then, of course, we're led from that to the final scene, which again is a spectacular set piece. You see these dyads and these triads throughout the film. That you see the menage a trois between Joe and his wife, presumably still his wife, and his girlfriend, who have become friends. You see the triad of Joe, his wife, and the daughter. You see the triad of Joe and his girlfriend and the daughter, who have become close. You see this again and again. You see the use in various ways of duos and trios. Again, this repetition which unifies the film. And of course, the final number with all the risers and the musicians dressed like they're in Kiss, and the spectacular body costumes of his wife and his girlfriend, and Ben Vereen, just, as I say, just being excruciating. And they're singing, Bye Bye Love, the old Everly Brothers tune, which is quite a sweet song, but it becomes Bye Bye Life in this. And again, it becomes really quite sour, where, well, let's see, Ben Vereen, he becomes honest at the end, that everyone becomes honest. And, you see, Joe knows this. Joe is no fool, that he knows that when you're successful, everyone sucks up to you, that you can't expect the truth from anyone, particularly in show business. And Ben Vereen's character, he mocks what he had said, what we've seen him saying again and again, just this, this grotesquely flattering introduction. He says, "Folks, what can I tell you about my next guest? This cat allowed himself to be adored, but not loved. And his success in show business was matched by failure in his personal relationship bag." Now, that's where he really bombed. And he came to believe that show business, work, love, his whole game, even himself and all that jazz was bullshit. He became numero uno game player, up to the point where he didn't know where the games ended and the reality began. Like for this cat, the only reality is death, man. Ladies and gentlemen, let me lay on you a so-so entertainer, not much of a humanitarian, and this cat was never nobody's friend. In his final appearance on the great stage of life, you can applaud if you want to, Mr. Joe Gideon. Now, the point is that people are going to say, oh, yeah, this is banal. Well, this is a cliche. Well, you see, Bob Fosse shared this with Stanley Kubrick. Yeah, it's banal. It's a cliche. So it's true, isn't it? The fact that you become a success, particularly in show business, and everyone is lying to you and they don't really care about you, does that hurt or does it not hurt? The fact, everyone has to die, and some people, die at, at times they wouldn't have chosen to, in the peak of their career. Yeah, it's cliche, isn't it? It happens all the time. It's still painful, isn't it? This is, I suppose, this is a very meta film. It is really remarkably self-aware. That is to say, there is really nothing. There's really nothing that you could say to Joe Gideon, or presumably to Bob Fosse, to him, that he wouldn't know already. And there's a very hilarious scene with Cliff Gorman, who's visiting the hospital and seems to be frowning at everything. He seems to be a bitter person. And he's saying these, in effect, insulting a man on his deathbed. And Joe Gideon just says, right. And finally he says something like, I'm not saying that you're a fag, but there seems to be a lot of, effeminacy about you. And he says, right. It's like he's come through the other side at this point. Again, there is nothing that you can say to him that he hasn't heard before, or worse, that he hasn't thought of before. And one more reference to the unity, of course, Joe Gideon is spending an enormous amount of time and money on this musical, but at the same time, he's gone months over time on editing the Lenny film, the stand-up film. And you see how his real life is reflected in the film, which reflects, the film is it's self-reflecting as well. And it's really it's reached a level of sensibility which is really extraordinarily rare. Those are I could talk about this movie for a long time because I love it so much. I also love Star 80, which I talked about on Luke's show a few months ago. The sad thing about this movie is that Bob Fosse pretty much predicted his own life, particularly his death. That he died in Washington in a revival of Sweet Charity. Always working on all of these different things, working himself too hard, drinking too much, smoking too much, carrying on with all these women. And, I suppose there's a kind of nobility in this, that he realized that he was lashed to the mast of his work. And even though one gets the impression, particularly if you look at how he changes the choreography in the big number about the flight attendants in his musical, how it's a rather sweet number at first, and then he has to make it darker and more sexual. And there's some very funny lines from the producer who says, "There goes the family audience," and the songwriter who says, "Now Sinatra will never cover this." But it's like Bob Fosse has this compulsion. He has this compulsion for darkness. And you see in all that jazz that he realizes that he can't help himself, but he's of two minds about it. He's never satisfied with his own work, but you get this feeling that he rather hates himself for this compulsion to seek the dark side of human nature. So those are my thoughts on all that jazz. 10 out of 10, A+ from me. So, approaching peak David Lynch. What in my hair? Unruly? What with the shadows? I'll try to do something about that next week. I'll final look at the chat here. Okay. All right. I don't know. I could never get past my dislike for musical theater. Well, I think my dislike of musical theater is probably greater than yours, Visionary Companion. Also, not just musical theater. I do not like ballet. But there's another movie about ballet called, The Red Shoes. After I saw The Red Shoes, which is one of my very favorite films, I thought, if ballet dancers could actually fly as they do in The Red Shoes, or if they could shapeshift as they do in The Red Shoes, I'm sure I would like ballet a lot more than I do. But I don't like musical theater, and I don't like dance, but I do love all that jazz because one has to admire. One has to admire the skill of the dancers, and one has to admire the choreography and the staging of it, the photography of it, the editing of it. Oh, and I should mention the sound editing on this film. Again, absolutely outstanding. There's a scene where there's a first table read of the musical, and everyone's laughing uproariously, and Joe is about to have an attack of angina. I've never suffered from angina, but Louis Ferdinand Celine he was a physician, he compared it to having your heart as like piano wire being dragged through your heart. And all the other sound cuts out. And we just see sounds like, him snapping a pencil or drumming his fingers, just how the whole world has closed in on him. Okay, so that is the show for today. Tomorrow is the book club. We will be talking about Ron Hansen's novel, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. I really had no idea the state of Missouri was so lawless back in those days. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much for viewing, listening in. If you'd like to support the show, and I would greatly appreciate that, especially now in my current situation, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I will leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly hope that all of you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.